So if I asked you to picture, the most secure lock in the world, you probably imagine a titanium bank vault.
Right.
Or maybe a concrete bunker buried deep inside a mountain somewhere.
Right, with the guys in earpieces and assault rifles guarding the door.
Exactly. Because we naturally default to physical barriers. We think of security as binary. You either have the clearance to be inside the room or you are kept outside.
Yeah, it's a very physical way of looking at it.
But the most impenetrable barrier ever built by the U.S. government isn't made of steel at all. And it isn't a physical wall. It's made of paper.
A piece of paper that effectively silenced tens of thousands of people.
Right. An oath of secrecy so terrifying and so legally absolute that it successfully kept everyone perfectly silent for decades.
Which is really the underlying architecture of a true black operation. It's the perfect lens for what we're looking at today.
It really is. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are taking a massive stack of research today, drawing really heavily from journalist Annie Jacobsen's incredibly sourced book, Area 51, an uncensored history of America's top secret military base.
And it is a wild ride of a book.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the mission for you, listening right now, is simple, but pretty ambitious. We are going to completely strip away the pop culture mythology of the little green men and the flying saucers.
We have to get past the Hollywood version.
Yeah, exactly. Instead, we're going to look at the factual, heavily documented, and honestly infinitely wilder true history of Area 51.
Though, to really appreciate that true history, we do have to start by looking at the illusion itself and how that illusion was weaponized.
Right. The illusion really cemented itself in the mainstream back in November of 1989. Yeah, this guy, Bob Lazar.
Oh, yeah, Bob Lazar.
He goes on local Las Vegas television and essentially claims to blow the lid off Area 51. He said he worked at this highly restricted outpost called S4, right on the edge of the base.
And his claim was that his job was reverse engineering the anti-gravity propulsion from, 9 captured alien spacecraft?
You have 9 of them. And people who follow this topic know the Lazar story inside and out. But what often gets overlooked is the profound irony of this whole situation.
Because Lazar wasn't just some guy who walked in off the street. He actually got his job referral through Dr. Edward Teller.
Wait, Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb.
Exactly. Teller was the co-inventor of the world's most powerful weapon of mass destruction. So Lazar had this documented real proximity to legitimate, terrifying power.
That's crazy to think about.
It is. The public was just starved for secret knowledge at that time, and Lazar acted like a modern-day Faust. He broke a sacred secrecy oath to share this story with the world.
But the great irony here is that the real foundational secret of Area 51 wasn't extraterrestrial at all. It was entirely bureaucratic.
Completely bureaucratic.
Which, I have to admit, sounds almost anticlimactic at first. You're telling me the biggest secret of America's most mysterious military base is essentially a filing system.
I know, it sounds incredibly mundane until you realize how legally terrifying this filing system actually was. It stems from the Atomic Energy Act of 1946.
Okay, 1946, so right after the war.
Right, and this act created an unprecedented system of secret keeping. It was built around this concept of information being, and this is the key phrase, born classified.
Okay, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around born classified. Usually, someone writes a memo, a general reads it, decides it's sensitive, and literally stamps top secret on it.
Right, that's your standard military classification system. Someone makes a decision to classify it.
But born classified means the moment a thought leaves a scientist's brain and hits the paper, it is automatically a state secret.
Yeah.
Regardless of who stamps it.
Exactly. From the second it exists, it's classified. It's like an ultra-exclusive club where the bouncer doesn't just turn away regular people, they can turn away the President of the United States.
Wow.
Because under this act, even the President doesn't automatically have a need to know for atomic secrets.
That is wild. The President can just be locked out of the loop entirely.
Precisely. And that is exactly how the Atomic Energy Commission, or the AEC, operated. They could hire private contractors, and all their work existed completely outside standard congressional or military oversight.
And this is vital context because Area 51's very first customer wasn't the CIA, and it wasn't the Air Force. It was the AEC.
The extreme secrecy wasn't designed to hide aliens. It was designed to hide a terrifyingly earthly arms race.
Right, an arms race that kicked into high gear because of a very specific, highly misunderstood event in the summer of 1947.
You're talking about the Roswell crash.
Yeah, the Roswell crash.
Yeah.
And Jacobs's book offers a heavily researched, incredibly shocking explanation of what actually crashed in the New Mexico desert during that massive lightning storm.
Because the military was right about one thing from the start. It wasn't a weather balloon.
No, definitely not a weather balloon.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a Martian ship either.
Right. The sources indicate that what investigators actually recovered was a wingless, tailless flying disc. And inside this craft, they didn't find alien hieroglyphics.
They found block letters from the Russian Cyrillic alphabet, embossed in a ring inside the vehicle.
Which completely changes the narrative.
Okay, wait. A Russian craft crashing in New Mexico in 1947. How does a Soviet disc even get to the American Southwest? And what was inside it? Because, the rumors of bodies at Roswell have persisted for 80 years.
Well, this is where Jacobsen's research presents a deeply unsettling narrative. According to her sources, the U.S. military realized they were looking at Soviet technology based on the designs of Walter and Reimar Horten.
Right, the Horten brothers, they were German paperclip-era scientists, weren't they? They designed advanced flying wings for the Third Reich.
Yes, exactly. At the end of World War II, the U.S. launched this frantic manhunt called Operation Harass to find these brothers. They were terrified that Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin had captured them and their technology.
Because if the Soviets possessed hover-and-fly technology that could evade U.S. radar, America was completely defenseless.
Absolutely defenseless. But according to the book, Stalin didn't just want to build a spy plane. He wanted to execute a massive psychological operation.
Like a black propaganda attack.
Precisely. Jacobsen's sources claim that Stalin enlisted another captured Nazi, the horrific Dr. Joseph Mengele.
Oh, wow. That is dark.
It's incredibly dark. The book posits that Mengele surgically altered children to look like deformed, oversized-headed aliens. And these children were placed inside this Horton-style hovercraft, which was towed by a bomber and dropped over the U.S.
So the idea being that when the craft crashed, the American public would find these quote-unquote aliens and just completely lose their minds.
Yes. Stalin was allegedly inspired by the 1938 War of the Worlds radio broadcast on CBS.
The Orson Welles broadcast.
Yeah.
Where people legitimately thought Martians were invading New Jersey. I mean, hospitals were admitting people for shock. People were fleeing their homes with shotguns.
Exactly. The military learned a hard lesson that night about the psychology of panic. They realized the American public could be very easily manipulated into mass hysteria.
So when the military finds this crashed Soviet disc in New Mexico in 1947, they face this terrible choice. If they admit Stalin has hovercrafts that can penetrate U.S. airspace, the public panics.
Right.
But if they admit the craft is filled with surgically altered children designed to look like aliens, the panic is even worse.
You have to put yourself in the shoes of an average citizen in 1947. You just survived a brutal world war, and now you're being told the enemy can casually drop nightmare discs over your backyard.
So the government decides that lying, the whole weather balloon cover story, isn't just a cover-up. They view it as a necessary protection against mass hysteria. Total secrecy becomes the only way to maintain a strategic edge.
But secrecy alone doesn't win a Cold War. America couldn't just build bigger bombs to deter an attack. They needed to know exactly what Stalin was building.
They needed a completely new way to spy on the enemy from above. Which brings us to the birth of overhead espionage.
And to understand how radical this idea was, we really have to look at Operation Crossroads in 1946.
Right. The military is testing nuclear bombs on a fleet of captured empty World War II warships out at Bikini Atoll. They detonate the Baker bomb, which is this 23-kiloton underwater nuke, and the water column is massive. It violently tosses these giant steel warships up into the air like they're bathtub toys.
It was an awesome and terrifying display of atomic power. And among the observers was a young engineer named Alfred O'Donnell. He was standing on a deck miles away from the blast.
And O'Donnell is so mesmerized watching the mushroom cloud unfold that he completely forgets to hold on to the ship's rail. The shockwave travels across the ocean, hits his ship, and literally throws him 10 feet across the deck.
Watching that exact same blast were two military men who represented the two competing philosophies of the early Cold War. First, you had General Curtis LeMay.
Right, the bomber guy.
Exactly. He looked at that destruction and believed sheer force was the only answer. He thought you win wars with massive bomber fleets carrying nuclear weapons.
But then you have Colonel Richard Leghorn. He watches the bomb and realizes that brute force will just lead to mutually assured destruction. Leghorn believes that to prevent a nuclear holocaust, you don't need more bombers. You need cameras.
Yes, cameras.
You need spy planes flying so high, say 70,000 feet, that Enemy radar just can't track them, and missiles can't reach them.
And Leghorn's vision of high-altitude espionage ultimately wins out. It was championed by a brilliant CIA officer named Richard Bissell.
But Bissell had a massive problem, right?
Right.
The military establishment, who were totally loyal to LeMay's bomber philosophy, they weren't going to fund some CIA spy plane.
Not a chance. So Bissell does something incredibly audacious. He was actually the executor of finance for the Marshall Plan.
Which was the multi-billion-dollar economic recovery plan for post-war Europe.
Right, and Bissell literally siphons money from the Marshall Plan to secretly finance the CIA's Office of Policy Coordination, which eventually funds the U-2 spy plane project.
He essentially created the ultimate black budget.
He did.
It's like a corporate accountant quietly embezzling from the company's public charity fund to build a secret underground laboratory, completely bypassing the board of directors, or, in this case, congressional oversight.
It's a great analogy. And with the findings secured, Bissell and Lockheed's genius aeronautical engineer, Kelly Johnson, they needed a place to build and test this plane.
So they fly over the Nevada desert and they spot Groom Lake. It was this flat, hardened salt pan, basically a perfect natural runway.
And crucially, it was tucked safely just outside the AEC's nuclear testing grounds. It was geographically isolated, sure, but more importantly, it was legally protected by that Bourne classified AEC umbrella we talked about.
So they have the money, they have the secret base at Area 51, and they finally build the U-2. But building a secret plane in the middle of the desert is one thing. Keeping it secret once it takes to the sky is a totally different problem.
Oh, absolutely. Especially because to fly at 70,000 feet, where the air is just incredibly thin, the aerodynamics of the plane had to be completely bizarre.
The engineering requirements completely dictated the shape. To generate lift in such a thin atmosphere, the U-2 needed massive surface area. It essentially had to be a jet-powered glider.
And the wings were so long and flimsy that they literally sagged. They touched the tarmac when the plane was parked.
Wait, they literally scraped the ground?
Yeah, they drooped right down to the ground. But here is where the unintended consequences kick in. When these unpainted silver planes were flying at 70,000 feet, they would catch and reflect the intense, high-altitude sunlight.
Ah, and commercial airline pilots who are flying at a standard, 20,000 feet, would look up and see what looked like fiery crosses or glowing flying saucers streaking across the sky above them.
And reports of UFOs absolutely flooded in. The CIA knew immediately that their U-2s were causing the sightings. They were actively tracking the flight logs against the civilian reports.
But instead of correcting the public, the director of Central Intelligence at the time, Walter Bedell Smith, recognized a massive tactical opportunity.
Yes, this is a wild pivot.
Seriously, are you saying the U.S. government intentionally gaslit the American public into believing in aliens just to hide a spy plane?
They absolutely systematically leveraged the hysteria. Cover and disinformation are standard CIA tactics. If they admitted it was a spy plane, the Soviets would know America was surveilling them and they'd work to shoot it down.
Right.
But if the public thought it was aliens, Soviet intelligence would dismiss the reports as just American civilian hysteria.
Jacobsen even notes they actively monitored former German paperclip scientists like Dr. Walter Riedel, who were going around promoting extraterrestrial theories to major magazines like Life.
Exactly. The CIA let Riedel spin these stories because his alien theories were the perfect camouflage for their aerospace engineering.
And this deception really paid off strategically. Letting civilians chase ghost stories kept Soviet spies off the scent long enough for the U-2 to become operational.
It did. In 1956, a pilot named Hervey Stockman flew the U-2 directly over the Soviet Union. And the high-resolution photos he brought back proved that the terrifying bomber gap, this congressional fear that Russia had hundreds of long-range bombers ready to strike, was a total myth.
The photos showed the Soviets were farming. They were not gearing up for an imminent nuclear strike.
The intelligence from the U-2 basically prevented World War III.
But, while the U-2 was up at 70,000 feet safely exposing Soviet secrets, the personnel back on the ground at Area 51 were subjected to a very real, deadly threat right in their own backyard.
Because Area 51 shared a border with the Atomic Energy Commission's Nevada test site.
Right. And this brings us to Project 57, which was a dirty bomb test. The military wanted to know exactly what would happen if an Air Force plane carrying a nuclear warhead accidentally crashed on American soil.
So they simulated it. Just northwest of Groom Lake, at a spot called Area 13, they detonated high explosives around an actual nuclear core.
Wow, just out in the open.
Yeah, but it wasn't designed to create a massive nuclear yield or a giant fireball. The explosives were meant to pulverize the core and spread deadly radioactive plutonium particles over 895 acres of the desert.
And plutonium is an absolute nightmare substance.
It really is.
Yeah.
It has a half-life of 24,000 years. If you inhale even 1/1,000,000th of a gram, it is lethal. It lodges in your lungs and emits alpha particles until it causes cancer.
And to guard this irradiated nightmare zone, the government hires a guy named Richard Mingus. Now, Mingus was a former Las Vegas casino waiter. He used to serve drinks to Elizabeth Taylor at the Sands.
Talk about a career change.
Seriously. He takes this job as a security guard just to get health insurance for his pregnant wife. Suddenly, Mingus is pulling 12-hour shifts out in the freezing desert, guarding a perimeter that the government knows will be contaminated for 20,000 years.
It just highlights the surreal nature of the black world. You have average citizens quietly performing incredibly hazardous duties under the shield of absolute secrecy. And the nuclear testing didn't stop with the dirty bomb.
No, not even close. A few months later, during Operation Plum Bob, the AEC set off the Hood bomb.
The Hood bomb?
Yeah, this was a 74-kiloton thermonuclear device. It was, and honestly still is, the largest atmospheric bomb ever detonated over the continental United States. The flash from the blast awakened people in Los Angeles.
Which is 350 miles away.
Right. The blast wave was so intense it actually buckled the heavy hangar doors at Area 51 and shattered windows across the base. The CIA had to completely evacuate the facility.
But standard protocol meant someone had to stay behind to guard the classified material that was just too sensitive to be moved.
And that guy was Richard Mingus. The contrast to this scene is just staggering. Mingus is sitting on the hood of his AEC truck. He's heating up a can of Dinty Moore stew on the engine block.
Just having dinner.
Just having dinner. And just a few miles away, a radioactive mushroom cloud from a 74-kiloton bomb is smoldering over the mountains. The desert brushes on fire, the sand is literally turning to glass from the heat, and Mingus is just eating his stew, making sure no Soviet spies wander into the fallout zone to steal the CIA's mail.
It is a profound image of Cold War endurance, but the reality was that Area 51 had temporarily become a radioactive ghost town. And while they were dealing with fallout on the ground, the CIA was facing a massive crisis up in the sky.
Because Soviet radar was finally catching up to the U-2.
Exactly. Richard Bissell couldn't just tell his pilots to fly higher to avoid detection anymore. In October 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik into orbit.
Right, they proved their rockets could literally reach space, so altitude was no longer a defense.
Bissell needed an airplane that Soviet radar physically could not see. He needed to invent stealth technology.
Which introduces us to a physicist at Lockheed named Ed Lovick. He is essentially the grandfather of stealth. And Lovick realizes you can't just paint a plane to make it invisible.
Well, they had actually tried using radar-absorbing paint on earlier aircraft, but at the speeds they needed to fly. We're talking Mach 3, which is 3 times the speed of sound. The friction creates intense heat.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Adding thick, heavy layers of radar-absorbing material completely threw off the weight, the thermodynamics, and the aerodynamics. It was causing fatal crashes.
So Lovick realizes the plane has to be designed from the ground up to manipulate radar waves. He and his team build an anechoic chamber. It's a room so insulated with foam spikes that it absorbs all sound and electromagnetic energy.
You can literally hear your own blood pumping in there.
Wow. And they use this room to shoot radar at scale models.
And what Lovick figures out is that radar visibility is really all about geometry. He adds these things called cheens, which are sharp, sloped edges running along the fuselage. It makes the plane look almost like a flattened cobra with wings.
You know, I used to think stealth meant the plane absorbed the radar, like a sponge absorbing water. But the cheens actually do the opposite, right?
Exactly. It's more like a funhouse mirror. A radar station on the ground sends up a radio wave. If it hits a flat, vertical surface, it bounces straight back down to the receiver and the plane appears on the screen.
Right.
But the angled chines take that incoming radar wave and deflect it away. They scatter it into the atmosphere. The radar dish on the ground gets nothing back, making the plane effectively invisible. This design reduced the radar signature by an astonishing 90%.
But they still hit a massive wall. The plane they are designing, the A-12 OXCART, has these massive jet exhausts to push it to Mach 3, and those exhausts were acting like giant metal reflectors, bouncing radar straight back to the source.
Bissell was furious because the plane wasn't fully stealth. I mean, he threatened to cancel the whole billion-dollar project.
But Lovick steps up and saves the day with absolute chemical wizardry.
The cesium solution.
Yeah.
Lovick understood that he couldn't change the metal exhaust pipes, but he could change the exhaust gas itself. He proposed adding the chemical compound cesium to the specialized jet fuel. When burned in the engine, the cesium would ionize the exhaust gas.
It essentially created a highly charged plasma cloud behind the jet that actually did absorb the radar returns instead of bouncing them back.
Which is just incredible engineering.
It really is. And to prove all of this worked in the real world, they had to take it back to Area 51. They built a full-scale mock-up of the A-12 OXCART and hoisted this massive top-secret plane onto a 55-foot pole in the middle of the desert.
Just sat out there shooting radar at it from different angles to test its invisibility.
But the stakes were incredibly high because Soviet satellites were now orbiting the Earth, actively taking photos.
So every time a satellite schedule showed an overhead pass, the crews at Area 51 had to scramble to lower this massive plane off the pole, wheel it into a specialized hangar, and hide it until the satellite passed.
It was literally a billion-dollar game of hide-and-seek. But when you look at the final product, they succeeded. I mean, they built an unshoot-down, impedable Mach 3 stealth plane powered by ionized plasma, running on fuel so chemically stable you couldn't even light it with a match.
It was an undeniable engineering triumph. The personnel at Area 51, the engineers, the test pilots, the security guards like Mingus, they pushed aerospace technology decades into the future. They provided the intelligence that kept the nation safe when the threat of a nuclear exchange was a daily reality.
But achieving those miracles required an environment with zero oversight.
Yes, that is the duality of the black world. Area 51 operated entirely outside the bounds of democratic oversight, environmental safety, and public accountability.
So pulling all of these threads together, pulling them together, the true documented history of Area 51 is vastly more compelling than the science fiction we've been fed.
Absolutely.
I mean, this base was born from the bureaucratic shadows of the Manhattan Project. It was funded by siphoned Marshall Plan money, hidden behind a deliberate, government-sanctioned UFO disinformation campaign, and irradiated by actual dirty bombs.
It makes the idea of gray aliens at S4 look almost quaint by comparison.
It really does. And Annie Jacobsen's investigation leaves us with a final, very provocative thought to consider.
Yeah, her book acknowledges that Area 51 undeniably succeeded in its mission to protect the nation during the Cold War. But she poses a critical thesis. If a government is willing to irradiate its own land with plutonium, intentionally deceive its own citizens by promoting UFO hysteria, and partner with former enemy scientists to win a shadow war, we have to ask ourselves a very difficult question.
Right.
At what point does the cost of maintaining absolute unchecked secrecy become more dangerous to a democracy than the foreign enemies that secrecy was built to defeat?
That is a question that definitely sticks with you long after the facts settle. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you walk away looking at this history a little differently. Keep questioning the world around you, and remember, sometimes the most impenetrable lock isn't made of steel. Sometimes it's just a piece of paper.